Rain fell in a thin, relentless drizzle over the city, soaking the cracked sidewalks and washing neon lights into smeared reflections. Hannah pulled the hood of her second-hand coat tighter around her face, but the damp still found its way in, settling deep into her bones. It was almost midnight, but her steps had not yet carried her home. Not that she had one to return to now. A few hours ago, she had stood in the dim hallway of her dormitory, clutching a crumpled notice that told her she was out. No scholarship, no payments, no bed. The keys had been taken back by the warden with a cold shrug. She had thanked him anyway, her voice steady, her heart pounding so loud she thought he must hear it. Now she walked the city streets with an empty stomach gnawing at her ribs, and a single thought pulsing through her head. She could handle her own hunger. She had done it before. But the image of her grandmother hunched on their thin mattress, spooning watery rice porridge into her mouth, would not leave her mind. The old woman's cough had grown worse in the damp nights, and Hannah had caught her cutting back her own portions, so Hannah might have enough to keep studying. But now, with the dorm gone, with the part-time job at the campus library vanished too. Hannah had nothing. Nothing except a battered notebook pressed flat in her bag. Pages covered in careful handwriting that laid out her dreams like stepping stones: reclaim the scholarship, finish her degree, get a nursing license, pull them both out of this endless survival. She passed the glow of a bright glass storefront, a restaurant whose sign she had only ever seen from the bus. Through the steamed windows, she glimpsed linen tablecloths, people in soft cashmere scarves, crystal glasses half full of wine that cost more than she and her grandmother could spend in a month. Her stomach turned, but not for herself. She remembered the sound of her grandmother's breathing when she left, thin rattling, hidden behind a hoarse laugh when Hannah asked if she had eaten enough. One thought made her pause. A plate of food untouched inside could be warmth for a day's strength for her grandmother's frail heart. She knew how they looked at beggars in places like this. But this was not for her. She pressed her hand to her stomach, felt it growl, ignored it. Then she crossed the street. Inside the entrance, the warmth hit her like a physical wall. Her coat dripped onto the marble floor as the host frowned at her. She smoothed her hair back, forced her chin up. "May I help you, miss?" Her voice almost failed her, but she made it steady. "I am sorry. I just need to speak to someone who is leaving food. Please, I am not here to beg for money. Just the food, for my grandmother. She is old, she hasn't had anything but thin porridge for 3 days. The host's eyes narrowed, flicking over her coat the bag at her feet. He looked ready to say no when a voice called out from deeper inside. It was not loud, but it carried calm, measured. "Let her through." The host stepped aside, and Hannah moved forward, shoes squeaking on polished stone. The diners barely glanced at her, all except one man who sat alone at a table by the window. A single glass of red wine in front of him, a plate half finished. His hair was silver at the temples, his shoulders squared under an expensive dark coat that hung on the back of his chair. When his eyes met hers, Hannah felt her breath catch. Not because he looked angry or amused, but because he looked tired. Tired in a way she understood. She stopped a step from his table, the warmth from the candles brushing her damp face. "I am sorry to disturb you, sir." She kept her eyes steady on his. "I saw you had not finished your meal. If it would not trouble you, may I take what is left? It is for my grandmother, not for me. She has been sick. She loves stew." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. He said nothing for a long moment, his gaze drifting from her face to the bag at her feet, then back to her eyes. They were dark wide and determined not to beg. Something in him shifted, then a crack in the ice he'd kept frozen for 10 years since the car accident that stole his wife and their daughter, just 14 and full of dreams. He still kept locked away in boxes he could not bear to open. He pushed the plate toward her, then lifted a hand to the waiter hovering nearby. "Bring a fresh portion and hot tea, and pack something sweet too. For the grandmother." Hannah's eyes widened. She shook her head quickly. "Please, sir. Just the leftover is enough. I don't want more than you would throw away." Her voice trembled, but her shoulders did not. He looked at her, then really looked, saw the wet hair, the shivering arms she held stiff to keep them from shaking more. But he saw the stubborn dignity, first stronger than hunger. He nodded once to the waiter anyway. "Please sit, miss." "Hannah," she said, lowering herself onto the very edge of the opposite chair. "Hannah Collins. Richard Bennett." He said it without the weight of title or money, just a name. He watched as she sat small and soaked and stubbornly polite, and for the first time in years, he did not feel alone at his own table. Hannah sat so lightly on the edge of the chair that it seemed any moment she might spring back to her feet and vanish into the rainy night. Her fingers stayed curled around the strap of her old canvas bag, as if she feared it might be taken from her, though there was nothing in it but her notebook and a folded sweater too thin for this cold city. She did not touch the fresh plate when it arrived, though steam rose into the hush between them. Instead, she lifted her gaze to Richard Bennett and thanked him so softly that the words nearly slipped beneath the piano music drifting from the far corner. "You don't have to stay," she said quickly, as if worried she was a stain on his silk tablecloth life. "If you have somewhere to be, I can take it and go." Richard leaned back, studying her in the warm light. "Where would you take it?" he asked, not unkindly. He noticed the quick flicker of her eyes toward the door, then the window, then back to his face, a calculation she could not hide. "My grandmother is waiting," she said simply. She's in a borrowed room tonight. A neighbor. I was hoping to bring her something warm." She hesitated, then added, "She's 86. Her lungs aren't good." Richard felt that old ache pulse beneath his ribs. Patricia's mother had lived with them in her final year, the same quiet, raspy breath in the next room, the same worry in his daughter's eyes when she would tiptoe in with bowls of broth, pretending it was a picnic on a sick day. "You're studying?" he asked, gesturing at the bag. "Or you were?" Hannah nodded. "Nursing." A flash of something crossed her face, pride mixed with regret. "I was on a scholarship. Lost it this term. They said my hours didn't meet the full-time requirement. I was working too many shifts. I couldn't." She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. "I'll get it back." "I will. I just need to pay for the credits, then they'll reinstate me. I have it written down." She pulled the notebook from her bag before she could stop herself, the pages dog-eared and fragile at the edges. She flipped to a section and showed him. Goals. Tiny boxes drawn beside each line. Tuition, part-time job, Granny's medicine. Final exams. He read them carefully, the neat small letters that looked like someone still believed every dream deserved its place on a page. "You still have this," he murmured. "It keeps me focused," Hannah said. She almost smiled then, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Some people get tattoos, I guess. I get checkboxes." The tea arrived. She didn't drink until he gestured for her to. She wrapped both hands around the cup to warm her fingers before lifting it to her lips. He watched her, this stranger with soaked hair and eyes that reminded him so painfully of the child he would never watch grow older. Maybe it was the shape, wide and dark, defiant and quiet ways his daughter's had been when she refused to practice piano and insisted on building towers of old books instead. He wondered if she had grown, if she would have looked like this at 22. What roads would have carried her into the world? It hurt sharply, but beneath it stirred a warmth he thought long dead. "You could have asked for money," he said after a moment. "I don't want money," Hannah replied. She did not flinch. "I want a degree, and my grandmother needs warm food tonight. That's all." A waiter passed, slowing just a fraction to glance at her with the polite suspicion of expensive places when a stranger does not fit the chairs. Richard watched Hannah notice it too, the way she squared her shoulders, forced herself not to shrink. There was more steel in that small frame than he saw in boardrooms full of men twice her size. He leaned forward, folding his hands. "You remind me of someone," he said, the words rougher than he intended. "My daughter." He stopped. The rest sat between them like a ghost neither could see, but both felt. Hannah did not ask. She only nodded slightly as if to say she understood the silence people carry. She picked up the fork at last, gathering a piece of the fresh roast. But instead of eating it, she tucked it into the napkin. Careful, methodical. Every bite she saved, she wrapped for her grandmother first. Only when there was enough did she allow herself one small taste. He saw her eyes close for half a second when the warmth hit her tongue. Hunger stubbornly denied easing its claws for a moment. He asked her small things: where she had grown up, which campus she called home before the dorm keys were taken, which textbook she missed most. She answered with simple honesty, no shame, no embellishment. Between sentences she paused to check her phone, an old cracked thing looking for a message that did not come. He knew it was her neighbor, probably an elderly woman too, checking on the grandmother left waiting in a cold flat with only thin blankets and yesterday's cough syrup. "Will you tell me her name?" Richard asked quietly. Hannah blinked. "Her name. Your grandmother." She hesitated, then smiled for the first time, small, shy. "Rose Collins," she said. "She says she named me Hannah because it means grace. I think she hoped I'd have enough for both of us." The restaurant had emptied around them, the lights dimmed to a hush meant to signal closing, but no one dared approach Richard Bennett to ask if he needed his bill. He watched Hannah gather the napkin parcels into her bag, fitting each carefully as if they were gold coins. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" he asked. She stiffened. "We do. Tonight. Mrs. Alvarez is letting us sleep in her living room. Tomorrow. I'll find another neighbor. You shouldn't have to." He said more to himself than to her. He thought of empty apartments he owned in this city of boardrooms that cost more to light for an hour than she needed to survive a week. She stood then, sensing the edges of what he might say, her pride bristling like a fragile flame against a storm. "Thank you for the food, Mr. Bennett. Really. This is enough. We'll be all right. I have a plan." She tapped her notebook as if to prove it. He rose too, pressing a card into her hand. Plain white, embossed only with his name and a single number. "If it's ever too much," he said, "call this. Don't wait until you're out of options." She looked down at it, then up at him. Those eyes. His daughter's eyes, older, braver. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but unbowed. "But we'll be okay." She left then, stepping back into the rain with her coat still damp, her bag now heavier with warmth. He stood at the window and watched her disappear into the glow of the street lamps, the drizzle swallowing her small figure. The ache in his chest twisted, but behind it pulsed something fragile, something he thought buried with the girl who once begged him for bedtime stories long after she was too old to need them. He did not know what he would do yet, but he knew something had changed. A crack had opened in the walls he had spent a decade building brick by brick around a grief too heavy to lift. And through that crack a flicker of warmth slipped in, a reminder that perhaps, sometimes saving someone else was the only way to save yourself. The rain eased into a mist as Hannah hurried through the streets, her breath ghosting into the cold night air. In her bag, the bundled leftovers radiated warmth against her hip, a tiny promise she clutched like a lifeline. When she reached the battered apartment block where Mrs. Alvarez lived, she knocked gently on the peeling door. It opened to a soft creak and the faint smell of menthol rub and boiled rice. Inside, the old woman waited in a mismatched armchair beside a tiny space heater. Beside her, on a threadbare cot, under 2 blankets, lay Rose Collins, her frail shoulders rising and falling with each labored breath. Hannah dropped to her knees at her grandmother's side, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. The old woman stirred, eyes fluttering open. They were pale now, clouded with age, but still searching for her granddaughter's face. "I brought you something better than broth tonight," Grand Hannah whispered. She unwrapped the first napkin, revealing the warm roast and soft bread. The smell filled the small living room, making Mrs. Alvarez sigh softly behind her. She fed Rose tiny pieces, pausing when her grandmother's thin hands clutched hers. Rose's voice was hardly a voice at all now, just a rasp and a breath. "You didn't eat first, did you?" Hannah smiled faintly. "We shared Gran, like always." She sat with Rose until her breathing evened out, the color returning slightly to her cheeks. When the old woman drifted into a shallow sleep, Hannah leaned her head against the edge of the cot and let her eyes close. But her mind spun restlessly. Tuition deadlines, her grandmother's medicine nearly gone, the dorm room she'd never returned to. Her stomach cramped with hunger she refused to name. When dawn came, she slipped out before Mrs. Alvarez could insist on breakfast she could not spare. She took the city bus to the campus library, sitting in the farthest corner with her notebook open, searching the pages for something that felt like hope. She barely noticed the other students drifting past, well-dressed, carefree, grumbling about final papers. Once they'd been her people too. By late afternoon, she returned to the borrowed room. She found Mrs. Alvarez at the door, a tight look on her face. "Hannah, mija," the old woman said gently. "I got a visit today. A lady said she was from the city shelter. They say you can't keep sleeping here. The landlord's been complaining." Hannah's heart sank. But just 2 more nights, she tried. "I'm waiting on the new night shift. I just need—" Mrs. Alvarez touched her hand with a soft, papery palm. "You and Rose need more than this floor, Nina. You need real help." The word help made Hannah's pride twist in her chest. She thanked the old woman, packed her few things into her frayed backpack, and lifted Rose's photo from the dresser. She slipped it into her notebook like a promise she would not break. By dusk, they were gone again. Rose bundled in a thin blanket in the corner of the city's overworked night clinic. A nurse tried to scold Hannah about antibiotics and proper food, but her eyes softened when she saw Hannah's face, the stubborn tilt of her chin. A good girl, the nurse thought. Too proud for her own good. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Richard Bennett sat at a boardroom table high above the city. The walls of glass reflected a polished empire built on 20-hour days, and a name that made men lean forward to listen. But tonight, as his vice president rattled off quarterly figures, Richard's mind was elsewhere, on a thin coat, on a cracked phone, on eyes that reminded him of the daughter whose bedroom he still could not bear to clear. "You're distracted tonight, Richard," his sister Claudia said when the meeting broke. Claudia had taken her late sister-in-law's place as the family's voice of decorum. Cold, precise, untouchable. She noticed the slip of white peeking from Richard's pocket, the card he'd given Hannah. "You're not serious," she said, her tone a quiet cut. "That girl, the papers already have wind of it. Billionaire street girl. Don't be naive. She'll drag you down." Richard's eyes narrowed. She asked for nothing. Claudia arched a brow. "They always ask. You're too soft. You think you're saving your daughter every time you hand out charity. But one day, you'll wake up and find your name smeared across a headline for some pity project gone wrong." He rose before she could finish. "Don't presume to know what she is," he said evenly. "Or what this is." Claudia's voice followed him down the hallway, calm, poisonous. "Your grief makes you foolish, Richard. Be careful who you let inside it." He did not answer. But when he returned to his office, he sat in the dark for a long while. The city lights spread below him, like a map of a life he no longer recognized. He pulled out his phone, found the number. The restaurant manager had written down the girl's name beside it. Hannah Collins. He almost called. Instead, he closed his eyes. He thought of his daughter's last birthday. 14 candles, one gone dark before she could blow it out. He thought of Hannah, shoulders squared against the weight of the world she refused to bow to. He thought of the way she wrapped that meal piece by piece for someone else. The next day, the gossip broke. A blurry photo, Hannah stepping into the restaurant, rain-slick hair, the CEO behind her like a guardian angel, or a scandal waiting to happen. Mystery student seen dining with Richard Bennett. The comments beneath dripped poison gold digger. Homeless girl hooks old billionaire, playing him for sympathy. Hannah saw it by accident. A customer's phone left open at the corner store where she was buying tea bags with coins counted out to the cent. Her throat closed up as the cashier whispered to her coworker. That night, she curled against her grandmother's frail back, willing her shaking hands to stop. She did not call Richard. She did not know she was already a spark lighting the dry grass of his carefully ordered world. She only knew she had to stay invisible. The only way to survive was to keep moving. But the world once opened does not close so easily. The city had turned sharp and raw with winter by the time Richard Bennett found himself standing on the worn linoleum floor of a public clinic that smelled of antiseptic and old hope. He had not come here in a decade, not since his foundation quietly funded the wing in memory of his wife Anne and the daughter he never stopped mourning. But tonight was different. It started with a single voicemail left on his private line. Not from Hannah, but from Mrs. Alvarez, her voice tremulous and apologetic. "She won't ask Mr. Bennett. She won't take your money. But she's sick. The fever's too high. I don't know what else to do." So he came. No convoy of aides, no private doctor whisked to some discreet hotel suite. Just Richard in a dark coat too fine for the chipped tiles beneath his shoes, asking a tired nurse for a girl whose name he knew too well. He found her curled on a stiff cot in the corner of a hallway, separated from the waiting room only by a thin curtain. Hannah's hair stuck to her forehead, damp with sweat. Beside her, Mrs. Alvarez sat holding her hand, lips moving in whispered prayers in Spanish and broken English. On the floor by Hannah's hip lay her battered canvas backpack, half open, the frayed edge of her notebook visible inside. Richard took it in every detail: the flushed cheeks, the cracked lips, the girl who had given away her dinner to an old woman too proud to ask for more. His throat tightened as he watched her eyelids flutter weakly at the sound of his shoes scuffing the linoleum. "Mr. Bennett." Mrs. Alvarez whispered, rising to her feet as if in the presence of something holy. "She didn't want to bother you. Please don't be angry." Richard sank to his knee beside the cot. "You did the right thing." Hannah stirred, blinking blearily up at him. For a moment, her fever-glazed eyes looked so much like his daughter's that it made his chest ache. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured, her voice hoarse but stubborn. "This isn't your burden." His mouth twitched into something like a smile, dry and cracked from years without use. "Let me decide what my burdens are." He stayed until dawn. He paid for a private room in the same building, discreetly, quietly. No cameras, no headlines. He sat by her bed as the IV drip ticked through the hours, Mrs. Alvarez dozing fitfully in a chair nearby. Once Hannah woke to find him reading her notebook by the muted glow of the bedside lamp. Her goals scribbled in neat lines. Finish degree, find steady work. Take care of Gran. Start community aid fund one day. She croaked. "Don't read that." He looked up, eyes soft. "It's the bravest thing I've ever read." In the small hours when her fever spiked, he called in his own physician. When she shivered, he draped his tailored coat over her thin blanket, and when she drifted in and out of sleep, she saw him, the powerful man whose name opened doors in every corner of the city, holding a paper cup of water to her lips like a father who refused to lose another child to a cold world. By morning, the worst had passed. She woke to the soft hush of the old radiator humming and the weight of Richard's coat still covering her chest. He sat in the corner, arms crossed, chin dipped to his chest in exhausted sleep. The sight cracked something open in her, a wound she'd kept stitched with pride and stubbornness. Quietly, she reached out and tugged the coat closer, a silent surrender to the warmth she had fought too long. When he opened his eyes, she whispered, "Why do you care?" Richard stood, adjusting the coat's collar around her shoulders. He did not answer at first. Instead, he reached into his wallet and slipped out an old, creased photo. A girl, 14, hair braided back, eyes wide with a spark. Hannah recognized in herself the spark that refused to bow. "She was my daughter," he said, voice rough with old rust. "Claire. She would have been 24 this year. She wanted to study social work, said she'd fix the world with kindness." Hannah's breath caught. He saw it, the connection, the thing she understood without needing more words, the mirror in her eyes. "I'm not her," she said quietly. "I know," Richard replied, placing the photo in her palm anyway. "But you reminded me what it's like to hope again, to see something good worth fighting for." She turned her face away as tears burned hot. Not out of pity for him, but for the quiet understanding that sometimes saving someone else is the only way to save yourself. The news, of course, found its way out. Rumors and sharp-tongued family whispers tangled into headlines, billionaire CEO seen nursing homeless student. The board of Bennett Industries bristled. Claudia called 3 times, leaving clipped messages dripping with disapproval. She's not your charity, Richard. She's your scandal waiting to happen. He ignored them all. Instead, when Hannah was strong enough to stand, he helped her into a cab with Mrs. Alvarez. He arranged a small, warm apartment, nothing extravagant but safe. He stocked the fridge with groceries she did not ask for. He gave her an envelope, a grant in her name, no signatures demanded, no strings attached, enough to cover tuition, enough to buy time. She tried to refuse. He gently folded her fingers around it. Not charity, he said, voice calm but unyielding. A loan, if you like. Pay it forward when you can. At the door, Mrs. Alvarez squeezed his hand. You didn't just save her, Mr. Bennett. You saved an old woman too proud to beg. Her eyes glittered with grateful defiance, but it was Hannah's voice soft behind them that cracked the last frozen place in Richard's chest. Thank you, she said, not bowing her head, not breaking her spine with gratitude. Just standing there, small but unyielding, a spark refusing to die out. In that simple word, he heard his daughter's voice echo across 10 lost years. And for the first time in a decade, Richard Bennett felt something thaw deep inside him. Not grief, not guilt, but a fragile, untested belief that maybe the world, broken as it was, still held room for second chances. By the time Hannah was strong enough to stand on her own again, the rumor mill had become impossible to ignore. Whispers trailed behind her whenever she crossed the small courtyard to the corner grocery store. Neighbors eyed her with polite curiosity, the girl who'd arrived overnight with a sickly grandmother, and the secret favor of a man who owned half the city skyline. It wasn't pity that bothered Hannah. It was the quiet venom she heard when she passed 2 suited men outside the cafe near her building. She'll milk him dry, one muttered, just watch. Richard Bennett felt it too. Boardroom glares lingered longer when he entered meetings. His family lawyer called twice, not to ask but to warn. They think she's using you, Richard. They think you've lost your edge. One evening, as dusk bled gold and ash across his penthouse office, Claudia herself appeared at the door. Richard almost didn't recognize her for a moment. Same polished suit, same careful hair. But the tightness at the corners of her eyes told him this wasn't about business alone. You didn't tell me she was living in one of your buildings, she said without preamble, dropping her handbag on his conference table with a thud. Or that you've moved money through the foundation again. Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. She needed help. Claudia crossed her arms, her silhouette cutting a sharp figure against the panoramic skyline behind her. She needed help. Or you needed to save someone because you couldn't save them. She didn't have to say the names. They pulsed between them like old wounds. Anne, Claire. He didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a file, Hannah's scholarship applications, copies of her unpaid tuition, a photograph of Mrs. Alvarez from a charity gala 10 years ago smiling beside Claire. She's not what you think, he said quietly. She's not a gold digger or a scheme. She's a hungry kid who gave her dinner to an old woman because it was the only right thing left to do. And He paused, letting the truth find its shape in the still air. I need to know I'm not done being human. Claudia's eyes softened for half a second, then hardened again. You're too smart to be naive, Richard. People talk. Investors listen. This arrangement, it looks like you're trying to replace. Don't you dare say it. His voice cracked through the glass walls like a bolt of iron. The air between them shivered. Claudia swallowed, but she didn't back down. The board is restless. They want this cleaned up. She'll be labeled your mistress, your scandal. They'll use it to drag you under in court if they can. You know how fast that narrative spins. Richard stood and turned to the window, the lights of the city blinking like far-off stars. Let them spin. I'm not hiding from this. In her tiny studio across the river, Hannah sat by Mrs. Alvarez's bed, tracing the creases in her grandmother's hand as the old woman slept. She could feel it in her bones, the shift in how strangers stared, the polite distance that turned cruel behind polite smiles. At school, a tutor pulled her aside after class. Is it true? About you and Mr. Bennett? His eyes were kind, but the question was poison just the same. Hannah packed her books and left early that day. She bought day-old bread from the corner bakery, a can of soup for her grandmother, and spent the afternoon cleaning every inch of the apartment until her body ached. She needed the work, the routine, the silence that let her think. When Richard knocked on her door that night, Hannah opened it with damp hair and sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The first thing she saw was not the man, but the exhaustion carved deep around his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she said, not unkindly. "They'll just twist it more." Richard stepped inside anyway, brushing past her protest. He took in the small, neat space, the borrowed blanket folded over Mrs. Alvarez, the notebook of goals tucked beneath a chipped coffee mug. He turned to Hannah, searching her face for any sign she'd break under this, but she stood, rooted, stubborn as ever. "They think you're using me," he said bluntly. "I know," she replied, voice small but steady. "Let them think it. I don't care about them. I care about her." She gestured toward her grandmother. "And about getting through school, and about paying you back when I can." Richard's mouth twisted into a pained half-smile. "You don't owe me anything. Don't say that," she shot back, sudden fire sparking in her eyes. "Don't take this away from me, too. I need to owe it. I need to know I got back up on my own feet with help, sure, but standing alone when it's done." He stared at her, then really saw her, not his daughter's ghost, not a scandal to be buried, but a young woman who refused to be erased by anyone's narrative, even his. In the hush, Mrs. Alvarez stirred, mumbling Hannah's name in her sleep. Hannah turned, fussed with the old woman's blanket, whispering something soft in Spanish that Richard couldn't catch. In that small domestic moment, the quiet dignity of sacrifice, the fierce warmth of care, Richard felt the walls inside him shift once more. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Whatever happens next, you don't fight it alone. Understand?" Hannah looked up at him, her chin lifted like a flag refusing to drop. "Neither do you." For a heartbeat, the ghosts in the room faded. The daughter lost. The wife mourned, the boardroom claws waiting outside. There was only this, two people choosing to stand in the cold light of other people's opinions and to stay standing together anyway. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something rarer, trust that no rumor, no headline, no polished whisper in a marble hallway could touch. And in that truth, both of them, the man who thought he'd used up every second chance and the girl too stubborn to beg, finally breathed easier side by side. The city moved on, indifferent as always, but inside the small studio that had become Hannah's fragile refuge, something shifted permanently after that night. She woke early the next morning to find Richard asleep in the chair beside Mrs. Alvarez's bed. His suit jacket draped over his shoulders like a makeshift blanket, his head bent forward in exhausted surrender. He must have dozed off while Hannah brewed tea hours before. She stood there for a moment, just watching him, that powerful man who commanded glass towers and corner offices, looking impossibly small in a second-hand armchair that squeaked when he breathed too deep. Hannah slipped quietly into the kitchenette. She made instant oatmeal for her grandmother, brewed fresh tea, set aside an apple for Richard. She moved like someone who understood that keeping small things warm was sometimes the only way to keep people warm too. Mrs. Alvarez stirred as the sky turned pale with dawn. Her voice was weak but clear. "Is he your boyfriend, mija?" she asked in Spanish, a mischievous glimmer in her tired eyes. Hannah nearly laughed but kept her tone gentle. "No, abuela. He's just helping." Her grandmother hummed, unconvinced. "He watches you like your father did your mother. Not same eyes, but same way. So careful." Hannah touched her grandmother's hair, pushing the thin strands from her forehead. "Eat your breakfast. Okay? Don't worry about me." But the seed was there now, rooted in Hannah's mind, as she watched Richard wake with a start when the clatter of the spoon hit the side of the mug. He straightened, embarrassed to find himself still there. "You should have woken me," he said, rubbing his neck. "You should have gone home," she shot back softly, handing him the tea. He accepted it, staring into the steam like it might tell him what to say next. "I didn't want to." Neither of them spoke the obvious truth that outside this small studio the walls were closing in. The gossip was spreading into boardrooms and press leaks. A headline had appeared that morning: "Billionaire's secret charity case. or something more. Richard's lawyers begged him to make a statement. Hannah's classmates whispered behind her back at the library loud enough for her to hear poor girl playing house with a billionaire. Through it all, she tried to shield her grandmother. She hid the newspapers, turned down the volume on the TV, but worry lines deepened on Mrs. Alvarez's face all the same. Then came the night when Hannah collapsed. She had pushed herself too far, skipping meals to pay for textbooks, sitting up all night writing scholarship essays by the dim lamp beside her grandmother's bed. When Richard found her, she was on the kitchen floor, notebook open under her cheek, her breathing ragged. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and quiet dread. Richard sat by her bed the way he had sat by hospital beds before, but this time the fear felt different. Not a sudden accident like the one that stole his daughter. Not a loss beyond his reach, but a fight he could enter. He refused to leave. When the doctor said she was malnourished, dehydrated, that stress had stripped her too thin to stand, he stayed. He called in the best private nurse he could find, signed paperwork. Hannah would have hated if she'd been conscious enough to protest. Mrs. Alvarez stayed too wrapped in a borrowed shawl, murmuring prayers over Hannah's pale hand. Once near dawn, Richard found himself drifting off beside her. The old woman's voice cracked through the hush. "She is strong. Stronger than you think." "I know," Richard whispered back. "But even the strong break." Hannah woke 3 days later, her body weak but her mind clear. The first thing she saw was Richard's head resting beside her hand on the blanket. His tie was gone, his shirt rumpled, but his hand was wrapped around hers as if he'd been clinging to it in his sleep. She could have scolded him, could have told him she didn't want charity, didn't need saving. But instead she squeezed his fingers, and when he stirred awake, she said only, "Thank you for staying." His answer was a ghost of a smile, soft and relieved. "Don't do that again." She almost promised she wouldn't, but they both knew she couldn't make that promise. Not while her grandmother still needed medicine. Not while tuition bills kept arriving with bright red stamps that said final notice. Not while she still had to fight for a seat at a table that never wanted her there in the first place. The scandal didn't fade, it got worse. Some reporters camped outside the hospital gates. A photograph leaked Hannah asleep in her bed, Richard seated beside her, his head bowed like a man in prayer. "He's lost his mind," the headlines screamed. "He's buying himself a daughter." Richard didn't answer the calls from the board. He didn't flinch when Claudia showed up at his office waving clippings like evidence. "You're ruining your legacy," she hissed. He answered her with a single line. "Maybe this is my legacy." In the quiet, a question flickered through Hannah's mind, one she hadn't dared to ask before. One night, as Richard sat beside her grandmother's chair reading her a newspaper article about new treatments for her arthritis, Hannah whispered it like a confession. "Why me?" He looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" She gestured around them. The tiny apartment, the stacks of medical bills he had quietly paid behind her back. The boardroom wars, she could feel pressing at the door. "Why did you stay? Why didn't you just walk away when it got ugly?" Richard set the paper down. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His eyes, tired, tender, met hers without blinking. Because once he said, voice steady as the rain tapping at the window, "I needed someone to stay. And no one did. And I will not do that to you." Hannah sat frozen. The old ache she carried, the loneliness, the small cruel lie that said you're on your own, cracked open in her chest. For the first time since her father's funeral, she let herself believe in the possibility of being someone worth fighting for. In that room, no lawyers, no cameras, no headlines, just a man who'd buried his heart beside his wife and daughter, and a girl who refused to bury her dreams beside her grandmother's pain. Something new took root. Not charity, not scandal, but a promise. When the world turns its back, I won't. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, two people sat side by side, no longer quite alone. The first week after Hannah left the hospital, the whispers turned into storms. Richard returned to his office at Bennett Holdings to find his senior advisors waiting, not with contracts or quarterly reports, but with printed headlines and threat-laced ultimatums. Claudia, his sister-in-law and acting board chair, led the ambush. She sat at the head of the long marble table, fingers drumming on a leather folio. Her eyes locked on Richard's as the rest of the board murmured in nervous clusters. "You're compromising everything we built." Claudia began, her voice calm as ice and twice as sharp. It was one thing to fund her tuition anonymously. Quiet donations. Fine. But hospital visits, leaked photos, your car parked at that rundown neighborhood 3 nights in a row. Richard, the world is watching. He didn't flinch. He only leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Let them watch. An audible hiss of disbelief slid through the room. Claudia leaned forward, tone cutting. "She is not your charity project, and she's not family. What do you think the board will do when shareholders start asking why you're funneling millions into a nobody with no pedigree, no connections?" Richard's voice cracked like a gunshot across the table. "Her name is Hannah Alvarez, and she has more character than half the people in this room." A hush. Even the junior legal counsel sitting at the back shifted uncomfortably. Claudia didn't back down. She tapped the folio with one manicured nail, each strike like a gavel. "You think this is about charity? It's not. It's about liability. She's not your daughter, Richard. She's not Patricia. She's not Ellie." At the sound of his late daughter's name, Richard's throat tightened. A quiet ache flickered in his eyes, visible to everyone, and Claudia saw it. She pushed harder. "She is using you, whether she means to or not. And when this ends, because it will end, the damage will be permanent. The press will turn her into a scandal, a gold digger. And you." Claudia's voice softened, but the blade underneath gleamed. "You will look like a man too broken to know when he's being used." Richard rose. He didn't yell, didn't slam his fist down. He simply stood tall, the way Hannah had seen him stand only once before. The night he sat by her grandmother's side while she slept, refusing to leave, even when the nurse told him there was nothing he could do. "If you want my resignation, draft it," he said evenly. "But understand this. I would rather lose every dollar in this empire than watch you turn away from someone who needed only a plate of food and a chance." When he walked out, his phone was already buzzing. A message from Hannah. "How did it go?" He didn't lie. "Not good. But I'm not changing my mind." Outside their bubble, the rumors thickened. Paparazzi parked near the studio apartment at dawn, hoping for a shot of Hannah pushing her grandmother's old wheelchair, or Richard stepping out of his black sedan with grocery bags. Internet trolls called her the poor student with billionaire ambitions. Talk shows speculated about a secret affair, a hush-hush payoff. Hannah did her best to shield her grandmother. She used the back alley when she could wear a hood up, kept her eyes down. But the world had found her anyway. One evening she came home late, exhausted after a shift washing dishes at a tiny ramen shop downtown. Richard sat at the small table with Mrs. Alvarez, helping her sort her medicine into a pill organizer. When Hannah entered, he rose instinctively. She almost wanted to laugh. This man who once owned every room he walked into now looked awkward in her tiny kitchen sleeves, rolled up glasses perched on the tip of his nose like an old professor. She set down her bag. "You shouldn't be here so much. They'll say worse things." Richard met her eyes calmly. "Let them." "You think I don't care?" Hannah said. Her voice cracked, betraying the wear she hid from everyone else. "I don't want your world to turn against you because of me." He stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "This isn't about the world. It's about us. Us." That single syllable hit her harder than any rumor. For a second, she wanted to say she didn't believe it, that she was just a girl from nowhere with a borrowed coat and a grandmother she could barely keep warm. But when he reached out, not to grab her, just to touch her sleeve, she didn't pull away. Mrs. Alvarez, half listening from her chair, spoke up in Spanish. "Él es bueno, mija. Let him be good to you." Hannah's throat burned. She looked at Richard, this man who had spent a decade sealing off his grief behind iron gates of work and money, only to find himself here in a studio apartment that smelled like boiled rice and old books. "Why are you doing this?" she asked half-whisper. His reply was almost too quiet to catch. "Because you remind me that I still can." A week later, the gossip reached the final frontier. Richard's inner circle. His best friend and lawyer, Andrew, found him in the private library at the club, papers in hand. "You know they're drafting a vote to push you out," Andrew said without preamble. Richard closed the file he'd been pretending to read. "I know. They're using her, Rich. Claudia especially. She's feeding them poison that Hannah's manipulating you, that you're unstable because of Ellie's death. They want you to look unfit to run the company." Richard's expression didn't change. He looked out the window where a thin drizzle streaked the glass, blurring the city lights into watercolor smears. "Tell them whatever they want," he said. "I'm not abandoning her." Andrew's voice softened. "I get it. God knows I do. But are you ready for what comes next? This won't just ruin you. It'll ruin her too." Richard's reply was the same promise he'd made Hannah without ever saying the words aloud. "When the world turns its back, I won't." In Hannah's pocket was a notebook she'd carried since high school, its pages filled with neat rows of goals. Finish degree. Find stable housing. Get grandmother new glasses. Pay off medical debt. And now penciled in at the end, almost timidly, prove to them all that this is real. Late one night, when the headlines screamed, "Scandalous charity," and Claudia leaked new stories to the press, Hannah sat on the cold kitchen floor beside Mrs. Alvarez's bed. Richard was asleep in the armchair again. She watched him breathe, one hand draped carelessly over the edge like he might catch her if she fell. She flipped to the last page of her notebook and scribbled one more line beneath the rest. He stayed. So I will too. Outside, the rain pattered on the cracked window. Inside, against all odds, a girl with nothing and a man with too much held on to the fragile truth that they could survive the storm if they did it together. It began with a cough. Small, harmless, easily dismissed. Mrs. Alvarez had been fragile for years, her lungs worn thin by too many winters without proper heat. But when the November wind pushed through the cracks in the window frame, the cough deepened. Hannah heard it every night as she lay awake on the small couch near her grandmother's bed. One morning, Hannah rose to make tea and found her grandmother slumped in the armchair, her breath, shallow eyes unfocused. Panic sliced through her. She called the free clinic, but their only doctor was already at capacity. She called the city helpline, but was told there would be a waiting list for a visiting nurse. When she hung up, Richard was standing in the doorway. He had come by early, bringing fresh fruit and some new blankets. One look at Hannah's face, and he crossed the room in 3 strides. "Tell me what's wrong," he said, his voice that calm steel she was coming to trust more than she wanted to admit. "She's worse," Hannah managed. "I don't know what to do. I can't lose her too." He didn't hesitate. He lifted his phone, spoke quietly to his driver, then to a private physician who owed him more than a few favors. Within an hour, Mrs. Alvarez was tucked into the back of Richard's black SUV, blankets piled around her frail frame. Hannah sat beside her, clutching her hand, whispering prayers in Spanish under her breath. At the private clinic, the diagnosis came fast: a severe chest infection. Easily treatable for most, but dangerous for someone her age with her frail immune system. She needs rest, warmth, good food. Medicine every 4 hours, the doctor told Hannah, who nodded feverishly, scribbling notes in her battered notebook. Richard spoke to the doctor privately in the hallway. When he returned, his expression was set. "You can't bring her back to that apartment," he told Hannah. "The draft's the damp, it'll undo everything." Hannah opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. "No arguments. She's coming home with me." That night, for the first time in decades, the Bennett penthouse, cold quiet, echoing with the ghost of a family it had lost, became a shelter for a trembling old woman and the granddaughter who refused to give up on her. Hannah sat up all night in the guest room beside her grandmother's new bed. She wiped her forehead with a cool cloth, counted her breaths, measured medicine doses. At some point she drifted off her head, resting on the mattress, her hand curled around Mrs. Alvarez's thin wrist. When she woke, there was a blanket draped over her shoulders. Richard sat in the corner armchair, a book open but unread in his lap. The lamp cast a soft pool of light that made the room feel impossibly gentle for such a vast apartment. He didn't say anything when she stirred, just met her eyes with that look, the one that made her chest ache in ways she could not name. "You should be in your bed," she murmured, her voice rough with sleep. "So should you," he replied. Days blurred. Richard rearranged meetings, canceled flights. Every spare moment he was home, drifting between his office and the guest room. He made soup badly, but Hannah pretended not to notice the burnt edges of flavor. He read the paper in the hallway just outside the door, as if his presence alone could keep the sickness from pushing its way back in. Late one night, when Mrs. Alvarez's breathing steadied for the first time in days, Hannah crept into the living room. She found Richard at the grand piano, its polished surface layered with dust until tonight. He pressed one key at a time, slow and careful, like testing old bones for movement. She paused in the doorway, watching him. He looked younger somehow in that moment, his sleeves rolled to his forearms, hair slightly out of place. The music, a soft tentative version of Claire de Lune, floated through the penthouse like a memory. "My wife used to play that," he said, suddenly not looking at her. Hannah stepped forward, barefoot on the marble floor. She sat on the bench beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder through his shirt. "You never told me about her," she said quietly. He pressed another key, let it linger. "Patricia. She taught our daughter too. Ellie. She was 14 when—" He stopped, fingers hovering over the keys, like a man on the edge of a confession. "I used to think if I didn't say her name, the grief would stay put, like a locked room I didn't have to open." Hannah reached out, placing her hand over his on the keys. Her palm was small, rough with dish soap and student ink. It made him shiver more than any winter draft. "Sometimes locked doors need opening," she whispered. He turned to her then, and for a heartbeat she saw not the CEO, not the philanthropist, just a man whose world had broken in half once and never quite stitched itself back together. "You did that," he said, voice hoarse. "You opened it. You brought them back." The piano's last note faded between them. Hannah thought of her grandmother asleep down the hall, of the warm bed, the soft blankets, the soup on the stove, of the plate of leftovers that had started it all. "You saved me first," she whispered. "You just don't see it yet." By the end of the week, Mrs. Alvarez's fever broke. Hannah found Richard asleep in the armchair again, a folded blanket over his chest, his reading glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. She stood in the doorway for a long time, her arms folded tight across her chest to hold in the ache that wanted so badly to spill over. Somewhere in this impossible penthouse, a man was healing by holding vigil for a grandmother he had never met until a rain-soaked girl asked him for a stranger's leftovers. Hannah tiptoed across the room, took the blanket from his lap, and carefully tucked it around his shoulders. For once, he didn't wake. He only murmured something soft, Ellie's name maybe, or a fragment of the lullaby Patricia once played. Hannah brushed her fingers through his hair just once, just enough to let him know he wasn't alone. For the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't either. Mrs. Alvarez regained enough strength to sit up by the window, wrapped in a soft cashmere shawl that Richard had ordered, specially the same color as the bluebells Ellie once loved to pick in the park. She liked to hum old lullabies as she watched the city from above, her gaze drifting between skyscrapers and the birds that sometimes perched on the balcony railing. Hannah, meanwhile, balanced her days between university classes, waiting tables part-time, and long evenings, studying in the corner of Richard's expansive library. The penthouse had become an accidental home, not hers by name, but hers in warmth. A place where Mrs. Alvarez's soft laughter drifted down the hallway, where the smell of coffee and old books blended with the low hum of a piano Richard now played when he thought no one was listening. One night Hannah found him sitting alone in the kitchen, a stack of folders spread before him, steam curling from his untouched mug of tea. She slid into the seat opposite, curling her cold fingers around her own chipped ceramic cup. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Richard rubbed his temples. "I was reading your notebook." Hannah stiffened, embarrassed. Her battered notebook, the one she'd carried from the day she left the dorm, was filled with scribbled goals, budget breakdowns, quotes underlined twice in red ink. "You weren't meant to see that," she murmured. "I know," he said gently. "But it's remarkable. You planned every dollar, every hour. You even mapped out how to pay for your final semester right down to the spare change." Hannah ducked her head, her voice small. "I had to. Dreams are expensive." Richard's eyes softened. He reached across the table, covered her restless hand with his. "Hannah, I've built companies, bought and sold entire city blocks, invested in ideas that seemed impossible, but I've rarely seen anyone invest in hope the way you do." She flushed, trying to pull her hand back, but he held it firm. "You said something that night," he continued, his voice low and careful, "when you asked for leftovers. You said you weren't asking for charity. You were fighting for your grandmother's dignity, not your own comfort. And that fight, it reminded me why I built my first foundation with Patricia." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Hannah stared at the heading, her breath catching when she read the bold print, "The Second Chance Fund." "What is this?" she whispered. "It's yours," Richard said simply. "A new program will cover tuition for students who lost their scholarships because of life, not laziness. We'll help with housing for those who have no place to sleep but still show up for class. And you." He paused, his smile tinged with pride. "You'll be the program's coordinator if you want to be. Finish your degree. Run this with me. Show them what second chances look like." Hannah's eyes filled. She pressed a trembling palm to her lips, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't deserve this," she breathed. "You do," Richard said. "Because you asked for scraps for someone else when you had nothing for yourself. You reminded me that helping someone isn't pity, it's remembering we're all part of something bigger." Hannah laughed, then a wet sound that cracked the quiet. She lunged across the table, hugging him fiercely. He held her like he hadn't held another soul since Patricia, his hands resting lightly on her back, as if he might shatter the fragile miracle of this moment. The next months passed like pages turning in a book she hadn't dared dream of reading. The Second Chance Fund launched with quiet dignity, no gala, no media fanfare, just a simple announcement in the university's student newsletter and a notice taped to the shelter's community board. The applications came in slow at first, a trickle of students who hovered outside Hannah's tiny new office, too proud to believe someone would help without asking for anything back. She greeted each one with the same warm patience she had once offered her grandmother's tired hands. She learned their names, their stories, their hunger. She stayed late filling out forms for housing credits, emergency food stipends, childcare. Sometimes Richard stopped by, leaning in the doorway with coffee and a soft smile, quietly reminding her she wasn't carrying this alone. Mrs. Alvarez's cough returned every now and then, but the warmth of the penthouse and Hannah's constant care seemed to hold death at bay, like an old friend kept politely at the door. She often fell asleep in her armchair, Richard's cashmere shawl tucked tight around her shoulders, the echoes of the piano drifting down the hall like a lullaby for a past too heavy to name. One afternoon, Hannah found Richard sitting on the floor by the grand piano photo albums spread around him like fallen leaves. He beckoned her closer, showed her pictures of Ellie, wild-haired, bright-eyed, the spitting image of what Hannah might have been at 14 if life hadn't carved its scars so deep so soon. "She was strong like you," he murmured, brushing a trembling fingertip over the edge of a faded photograph. "I think she would have liked you." Hannah folded her hand over his. "Maybe she sent me to find you," she said softly. He laughed. Then a small, broken sound, but it healed something in the room. The city woke early the day Hannah crossed the graduation stage. Mrs. Alvarez, fragile but beaming, sat wrapped in blankets in the front row. Richard stood beside her, one protective hand resting on her shoulder, the other clutching the edge of his coat pocket where a small velvet box waited for a moment that felt right. When Hannah's name echoed through the hall, Richard felt something shift inside him. The same fragile, stubborn hope that had first flickered when a rain-soaked girl had asked him for scraps for someone else. He met her on the steps after the ceremony. She ran to him like family, her mortarboard nearly slipping off her head. He caught her, held her close, the quiet press of her heartbeat against his chest, telling him that every ghost he'd once feared had finally found a home, too. That night, the three of them sat around the old kitchen table in the penthouse, Hannah's degree framed and leaning against the wall, Mrs. Alvarez humming softly, drifting in and out of a nap. Hannah held Richard's hand under the table, their fingers twined warm and steady. She knew tomorrow would bring new fights, new students to help, new wounds to heal, new scars to accept. But for tonight there was soup on the stove, music in the air, and the soft, patient truth that sometimes a second chance wasn't a gift from the powerful to the powerless. It was something you built together from leftovers, from grief, from stubborn hope that refused to stay buried. Years later, Portland would remember the Second Chance Fund, not as a charity, but as a quiet revolution that started with a single plate of leftover pasta under a rain-slicked awning outside a restaurant too expensive for most to even glance inside. In a small community center on the east side of the city, a faded photograph hung on a bulletin board, surrounded by bright sticky notes and printed flyers. It showed Hannah, a little older now, her hair tied in a neat bun, standing beside a small plaque engraved with her grandmother's name. Mrs. Alvarez had passed peacefully 3 winters after the rainy night that changed everything. Her last days filled with warmth and stories she'd once kept locked away. Below the photo, a quote read, "No one should ever have to beg for scraps when they're fighting to stand on their own." Richard's hair had turned fully silver by then. He still came to the community center every month, sleeves rolled up, pouring coffee for students who had learned to trust that the old man in the tailored coat saw them, really saw them, in the way the world so often refused to. They never called him CEO here. He was Mr. Bennett, the man who knew their names, who remembered who liked sugar in their tea, and who preferred it black. He still kept a photo of Ellie tucked inside his wallet, but when he looked at Hannah now guiding new kids through scholarship paperwork, fussing over dusty shelves stacked with donated textbooks, he no longer saw only a ghost of the daughter he'd lost. He saw the living proof that the ache of the past could be repurposed into something that grew green and stubborn in the cracks of a hard world. One crisp morning, a young student named Luis waited outside Hannah's small office. He shifted from foot to foot, clutching a tattered backpack and an acceptance letter with creases so deep it had nearly torn in half. When she called him in, he sat down on the edge of the chair, words catching in his throat, until Hannah pushed a mug of cheap cocoa into his trembling hands. "You don't have to explain," she told him, her tone warm but certain. "You're here. That's enough for us to fight beside you." Outside the window, Richard watched, leaning on his cane now but standing tall. He remembered a night just like this, a cold drizzle, a girl too thin for the coat she wore, asking not for herself, but for her grandmother's dignity. A plate of leftovers. That was all it took to break open 10 years of grief, and remind him that wealth meant nothing if it couldn't build bridges between the lonely and the lost. Hannah stepped out when Luis left her notebook, a newer one, now thick with scribbles and dreams tucked under her arm. She reached for Richard's hand without a word. He squeezed her fingers lightly, his eyes bright behind reading glasses. "You never stop, do you?" he asked, half amused, half awed. She shrugged. "There's always one more." He chuckled, the sound like gravel warmed by sun. "Good. The world needs stubborn women like you." They walked slowly down the hallway, lined with murals painted by the kids who came through the center. Some of those kids would fall again. Hannah knew that, but some wouldn't. Some would carry the echo of a warm meal and unexpected kindness, a hand outstretched, not in pity, but in faith that a person's worth was never defined by what they lacked, but by what they dared to hope for. And when they stepped outside into the drizzle that never really left Portland for long, Hannah turned her face to the rain and breathed it in, like a promise that second chances were never given freely. They were earned, shared, repaid 1,000 times over in tiny acts of grace. Under that gray sky, Richard's cane tapped a steady rhythm beside her quiet steps. The man who once measured worth in boardroom numbers now found it written in scuffed backpacks and borrowed jackets, the same details he'd nearly missed when Hannah first stepped into his world, hungry but unbowed. If you asked him now, years later, he would tell you without shame that he had saved her. But she would tell you the truth: they had saved each other. Not with money, not with pity, with the simplest miracle of all, leftovers given not as scraps but as seeds. And from those seeds grew a garden wide enough for every stubborn, hungry dream to bloom.